today, the topic that I chose, or it chose me, as it often happens, I'm calling it Whose Sky? A solstice meditation on what abides across difference. So today is summer solstice, the longest day. As we said, the sun is at its most northerly point, rising at a precise angle that 5,000 years ago the builders of Stonehenge oriented their stones to receive. On this morning, and only this morning, the light enters the central chamber of Stonehenge through the heel stone and illuminates the altar at its center. I want to begin there with the awe. Because what those builders did was extraordinary. And it is not just the engineering, but the sustained observation of the sky over generations. This is not the kind of wisdom that you gather in a day or a year or 5 years. It is generations of observing the sky, watching how the sun rises, how the sun sets through the year. One year it might be raining or it might be cloudy, so you need to gather that kind of data. And then they built something with that knowledge, because they knew whoever is the knowledge keeper is not going to be around, but they can leave something that will survive for generations. And it has. 5,000 years later, the sun still enters the chamber on this morning. How extraordinary is that? This is the body of a whole people oriented to the sky above them. And it's extraordinary. It's, just soars you. And at least it fills me with awe. What precision of observation. And from there, I want to pivot to what happens next. What happens after the awe. What happens when knowledge begins to travel. And this is where a specific kind of logic comes into play. I call it the empire logic. And the empire logic says, whatever was particular of this place and this time now becomes packaged as universal. So today is summer solstice. But truly it is summer solstice only in the northern hemisphere and the northern part of northern hemisphere. And we forget that. And as empire progresses, it brings this solstice lore to places that do not really have a solstice. We talk about the great wheel of the year, the 8 spokes, the solstices, the equinoxes, the cross-quarter days in between. And they're beautiful. And they really work in the geography where they were born. It really works in terms of planting, in terms of animal husbandry, in terms of building houses, all of it. But what we forget over enough generations is that this is hearth bread. This is the bread that was baked in a certain hearth with certain ingredients at a certain time. And it is nourishing for those who grew up with it. But somewhere along the way, the hearth bread becomes way bread, the hardtack of the empire. And it is offered to those people whose grandmothers cooked rice or teff or quinoa or flatbread on a stone. Not as one people's lore, not as one people's story, but the story. solstice for everybody. The human wheel, the universal turning. The problem is not that this is wrong, but the problem is that it forgets that it is particular to this place. So what I want to talk to you about, and coming from India, I am especially sensitive to this, how the lore of a particular people, a particular place is universalized as lore for everybody. So I want to talk to you about geography making cosmology. Because it really matters what is the sky your body stands under and your ancestors' bodies have stood under, because that's what makes the story. So as you know, I come from India, and sometimes we call it the waist of the earth, that area, because we are near the equator, we're sub-equatorial. And while the solstices and equinoxes happen because there's a lot of tilt in the Earth's axis at the poles, at the center there's almost no tilt. So the days and nights are almost the same length throughout the year. There is no longest day, shortest day. There is some, depending on how far you're from if you're sitting on the equator, it's not. As you move away from the equator, it starts to happen a little bit, but it's not dramatic. It's not like what happens in Northern Alps. It's not what happens in Stonehenge. So India, for example, it's an interesting story because we don't have 4 seasons. So 4 seasons is another of those universal lores, right? Everybody has 4 seasons. We have 6. And for us, the most important season is actually neither summer nor winter, but monsoon. Because everything turns around monsoon. If monsoon doesn't come, people don't eat. If there is too much monsoon, hundreds of thousands of people die. So that's the nadir of the wheel for us. And it's not just India, the entire subcontinent there. Call it Varsha, and you have the most number of poems and music and stories that are built around monsoon. Because what monsoon does is not just it brings water, but it breaks an accumulation. So the heat starts to build from somewhere around March, maybe even late February, and it becomes oppressive, relentless, the kind of heat where you can't even breathe because the air feels hot. And then the monsoon hits. So no wonder people see that as a blessing from the gods, because suddenly everything is transformed. The dust, the drought, the stillness, the endurance. And of course the floods come. They take things, houses, people, cattle, familiar shapes of land. And also, when that water recedes, you are left with the most fertile soil that you could ever have. That is the turning of the wheel for us. It's not solstice. It's the moment the monsoon hits. And like people everywhere, people mythologize their geography. So I want to tell you the story of this particular temple. It's a very famous place. It's called Kamakhya. It's in Assam, so it's northeast on a hill on top of Brahmaputra River. And during a particular time in monsoon, early monsoon in June, there is a very specific ritual that happens. It's a goddess temple. So there are 3 days in June where the entire temple is shut down, all the agriculture is shut down, and no one can enter the temple, and the water from the temple runs red. And it is said that the goddess is menstruating. And at the end of it, when the temple reopens, what the priests have done is they have laid down white cloth on the floor of the temple. And that red cloth is now stained red. They lay down white cloth and it's stained red. And that is shared with the devotees as an offering. That is the highest offering of that goddess. What does that story tell us? So scientifically, we know that the earth there is very rich in iron oxides and cinnabar, and when the rain comes, all that gets mixed in the water and the water turns red. There's also some algal bloom that happens at that time. So we can explain it. But there's something very particular about making it into a story of a goddess who's menstruating. Because it's the same thing, letting go of a cycle so a new cycle can begin. And during those 3 days of break, you're also allowing the agricultural land, for example, to absorb all the water, let the water settle before you start planting for the next season. So it is the goddess's fertility cycle, but it is also an ecological fertility cycle, because that's when you want to plant. And so people have taken what is geography and made it into the story of a goddess, a veneration of the geography. And there is no spoke in the great wheel for it. The universal great wheel does not include monsoon. And then let's move farther south. So we pass the equator, go into the south. People in Sydney, for example, are right now celebrating midwinter, because what is summer for us is winter for them. And what is interesting is that a lot of the European settlers in Australia, New Zealand, they have brought the great wheel with them from Northern Europe, and they have just flipped it. So now we have like Litha, which is the celebration of midsummer, that happens or midwinter, that happens in December, and Yule happens in June. So that's one way of just flipping the thing. But the stories are still the same. It's still the oak and the holly. And so it's the same cosmology, the same stories from Northern Europe that's been brought down. And what we forget is that these stories were not brought into an empty land. This was a land full of stories. So the Australian Aboriginal people, they are one of the oldest and the most sophisticated astronomical traditions on Earth. And what I find really fascinating, so there's a person, if you're interested in understanding more about the Australian Aboriginal lore, there's a person called Tyson Yunkaporta, who is a fantastic speaker, very funny. And he has a book called Sand Talk, but it's in general, like he participates in a lot of podcasts and stuff, and it's just wonderful. So he describes these, so in Australian Aboriginal idea, there is this idea of dreaming. And it is impossible to translate dreaming in the contemporary Western concept, because dreaming in one way is, the thought is that, okay, the world was dreamed by the ancestors. But I already made a mistake in even saying that sentence, because the world was not dreamed. It is being dreamed. It was dreamt, it is being dreamed, and it will be dreamed by the ancestors. Because most of the Australian Aboriginal languages actually do not have the sense of a past, present, future. They do not have words for it. Some Western authors have called this the every when. Imagine living in a cosmology where every when is your concept of time. The ancestors are not past, they're not present, they're not future, they're always there. They're co-present with us. And what is really interesting is in the astronomical system of the Australian Aborigines, you do not just have the constellations like we have in the West as well as in India, where you connect the bright points, the stars, to form the constellations. There, equally important are the dark spaces in between, and the shapes are studied. So for example, in the Milky Way, there are great dark patches where the light doesn't reach, and those are constellations in that cosmology. So you have the emu, you have the caterpillar, the possum. And Yankaporta tells this wonderful story about how when the emu constellation reaches a certain place and one bright star, it's the eye of the emu, starts to shine, that you know that that's the time to collect emu eggs. And so everybody has a celebration because those are like huge eggs. And yeah. So this is a living relationship with the sky and the land. And this has pre-existed the holly and the oak by tens of thousands of years. So again, it's not right or wrong. It is when something is seen as universal. That's where the problem is. And the last thing I want to talk about in this space, this is again from Tyson Yunkaporta. He tells the story of what happens when the Northern Europeans came with their hollies and oaks and other trees. They didn't just bring the stories, they brought seeds and they planted them in that land. Now the land is already lush and it has all kinds of vegetation on it. And so many of them became invasive species. So Tyson says that as an Aboriginal, he sees his job, and people like him, their job is to sing the newcomer into the community. So they will make a song of holly and sing that song to the native trees, saying, here, you have a new member of the family now. Know them, and so that you can live in balance, so that nothing outgrows everybody else. And this can take generations, you can make mistakes, you can, all kinds of things. And the other thing that, again, his cosmology, when he talks about it, is so powerful, is how it is, as the singer of the song, it is your responsibility to make sure that you just don't sing the song once and go away. You come back and visit again and again and again and make sure that the relationship is thriving, and if not, you change your song. And maybe he will pass it on to his kids, because it is a long-term custodianship of the land. There's a reciprocal relationship. And this is not just an Aboriginal story, it's not just an indigenous story. There was a holy person in Bengal, where I come from, in India. His name was Ramakrishna. I think many of you probably have heard of him. And one of his favorite teaching tools was this thing called, in Bengali we call it kochuripana, which is water hyacinth. And water hyacinth was brought by the British as a decorative plant. It grows in South America. It's beautiful ornamental plant, blue flowers, grows on ponds. Unfortunately, the plant escaped those ornamental ponds and became completely invasive, like choking up waterways and causing major havoc to fisheries and so forth. But what Ramakrishna did was he used the kochuripana as one of his greatest teaching tools. So he would, like one of the things he would talk about, like the quality of mind. He says, think of a pond covered with water hyacinth. You feel like you can walk on it. But if you put your foot, you're going to fall. And at the same time, if you just part the water hyacinth with your hands, there is clear water underneath. Water is not lost. It's just covered over. And that is the state of our mind often. We do have that clarity, but it's covered over by the water hyacinth. Something that we have imported, introjected. I would call that like all the models of modernity that are in our heads. They're like this invasive plant that had one time had a real purpose, but has just taken over everything else. So I guess the question really comes back to, for me, comes back to what kind of a world will it be if we stop looking for one story as the story, and instead we really create that table. And this is why I like the UU as a model. We create a table where the heartbread sits next to the rice, to the teff, to the quinoa, to everything else, and there's a feast, and we learn from each other's stories. That is Yankaporta's introduction, singing the holly into the forest. And we can do that. And if we do that, something extraordinary can happen. That is the true relationality. That the truth, even what is truth, that's a whole other conversation. But if there is any truth, it really lives in the space between us. It doesn't live in me, it doesn't live in you, but it kind of almost like grows in the relational space. It's larger than us. It's larger than what one person can hold. So the invitation today is, yes, let's celebrate solstice. It's beautiful. But let's call it what it is. It's a particular story for a particular people in a particular geography. And this is just an example of so many other things that we so quickly universalize in an effort to feel oneness, in an effort to feel like, oh, we are all one. But we are all one with particularities, with our eccentricities, and that's what makes this world so much more beautiful and so much more fun. So that's kind of where I want to stop. Just how do we do this work of introduction? How do we sing the newcomer to its neighbors? And how do we tend the web that holds everything? That nothing is outside of that web. And as I close, just an invitation, maybe 30 seconds. How is it landing in your body right now? How does it feel to imagine that table where all the grandmothers of the world and their grains are being served? And what becomes possible at that table that is not possible if we only each have our own grandmother's food? Or grandfathers, being Father's Day. With that, let us sing the next hymn.